Want to buy some illusions, slightly used, second hand. They were lovely illusions, reaching high, built on sand. They had a touch of paradise, a spell you can't explain. For in this crazy paradise, you are in love with pain. Want to buy some illusions, slightly used, just like new. Such romantic illusions, and they're all about you. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and then attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. So first off, I'd like to apologize. I know I said when I started off this second season earlier in March, I had made a resolution that I was going to concentrate on devoting Women's History Month to movies directed by women. And I had really high hopes for last week's edition too, because I was all set to head out to the IFC Center in New York City to catch a preview screening of La Chimera. This is the latest film from the Italian writer-director Elise Rohrwacher, but those got completely sold out, which I guess shouldn't be such a surprise, this being Rohrwacher's first solo feature film since her 2018 magical realist drama Happy as Lazzaro, which I highly encourage everybody to check out. It's a fantastic movie. But it did mean that I was short one hot new release for my new releases series, and so I kind of just had to resign myself to what was coming out locally, which of course brought us to... Anyway, I'm pleased to say that I was nonetheless able to make it out to the IFC last Friday to see a late afternoon showing of La Chimera as it begins its limited release rollout, and just in time to wrap up my Women's Film History Month, so let's get to it. Set in the 1980s, La Chimera stars Josh O'Connor as Arthur, a temperamental Englishman living in central Italy. We join Arthur as he returns from a stint in prison to the provincial commune in which he resides. He's got a shanty house set up on the outskirts of the town. Obviously, a rather hand-to-mouth existence. Pretty much the only real friend he has is an elderly dowager and music teacher named Flora. She's played by Isabella Rossellini. And despite the chagrin of her daughters, Flora treats Arthur almost as if he were her own son. We do learn that Arthur had a romantic relationship with Flora's youngest daughter, Beniamina, who we only see depicted in dream sequences. The conspicuous absence of her from the setting perhaps explains, in part at least, Arthur's air of bitterness and sorrow throughout the film. Arthur is also keen on avoiding his old friends, a gang of tombaroli, or tomb raiders, who seek out as yet undiscovered tombs and burial sites throughout the Italian countryside in order to sell artifacts on the black market. It isn't long, though, before Arthur falls back into his not-so-old ways, principally because it turns out Arthur seems to have an almost supernatural knack for dousing the locations of ancient sites. So what follows is basically a character study in which we observe O'Connor portraying this verbally inexpressive, mostly character who treads a fine line between inert cynicism and glimmers of some grander passion. Obviously, like the other Tombaroli, Arthur is poor and desperate, or otherwise simply poor and unconcerned by any pretense of guarding national heritage or historical stewardship. And yet, one of course wonders how this Englishman came to be here in central Italy in the first place, and especially in the poor conditions that he's in for a seemingly educated man experienced in artifact dealing. And he does at the same time keep some artifacts for himself in his own shanty house, so he has some attachment to them. Furthermore, his seeming sixth sense for finding these artifacts sees him portrayed as somehow magnetically drawn to them, with Rohrwacher and Cinematography cinematographer Helene Louvar frequently reusing a technique in which they will start on a close-up of Arthur and then tilt the camera 180 degrees so that we are now viewing him from behind and the plane of the scene upside down. It creates a kind of supernatural as above, so below effect. At one point, one of Arthur's fellow Tombaroli described this as his La Chimera, hence the title, which appears to be a state in which Arthur finds himself pulled between the worlds of the living and the dead. Once you add in the backstory involving the lost Beniamina, there does seem to be a rather obvious Orphic subtext to the story. Now, I personally was super excited to see La Chimera. I loved Happy as Lazzaro, which had this really sublime combination of neo-realism and magical realism. That's not a terribly unique insight on my part, but I am pleased to see that with this follow-up, Rohracher seems to only be diving further into that mixture of filmmaking traditions, that mixture of, on the neo-realist side, shooting on location, focusing on provincial or poor characters or characters on the periphery, drawing on some lesser-known or non-traditional actors for the supporting cast, often from those locations, and then on the magical realist side, this really kind of deft implication of the supernatural, or rather the spiritual being an animating force behind the action without it ever really escalating to a level that's over the top or cliche, at least cliche within the idiom of more commercial contemporary fantasy that most Americans would be used to. At the very least, again, returning with Louvar as cinematographer, La Chimera is also an exquisitely photographed film, and I'm even more pleased to say that it was in fact shot on film. Rohracher and Louvar working with Kodak 35mm and 16mm to achieve this very naturalistic, very fine, granular look where even the frame edges themselves, you find yourself being distracted by them at times, because in the digital intermediate process, they don't just seem to have scanned the film, they also seem to have applied a very nicely detailed and convincing template of a projector gate or viewfinder with these rounded off corners. That is, if they didn't scan the film through a more specialized means where that gate or viewfinder edge was included. I'm not quite sure. At the end of the day, there's a very nice dynamic between softness and roughness in the look of the film, which I think fits the tonal shifts of the narrative, especially that line between the natural and the magical, between the crude and the more poetic and symbolic. Because beyond merely the way Rohracher and Louvar shoot La Chimera, not only the visual language, but also the sort of languid pacing and really rather unpredictable narrative structure of the film, again, largely as a study of character, and even to a certain extent a study of this Tombaroli gang as a kind of metonymic poor Italian outlaw culture. Both the visual language and the narrative structure of La Chimera, and so much more overtly than with Happy as Lazzaro, it's so uncannily, I don't want to say old-fashioned because that gives the wrong connotations, and there are certainly many aspects of Rohracher's filmmaking, especially her and Louvar's cinematography, that is undeniably contemporary, but there's this really vivid and animated feeling when watching it, especially if you're decently familiar with post-war Italian cinema. This really rather striking feeling that at times you could be watching something that came out of the 60s and the 70s, which would be totally appropriate because as far as art house cinema, that really is a borderline period in terms of the development of Italian filmmaking away from the more grounded, sentimental style of neo-realism that had dominated immediately after the Second World War, and towards this more anarchic, this more spiritual, this more free-form and symbolic kind of realism with more magical or surreal elements. In particular, I can't help but see the way Rohracher traces and O'Connor characterizes Arthur as this really rather opaque and ambivalent central character and not recognize certain echoes, especially of the way Pier Paolo Pasolini cast the great Franco Citti in Acatone. And quite frankly, and this may just be coming from someone who Pasolini is my favorite Italian filmmaker, maybe even my idol as a filmmaker, so I was always going to be excited and on board with a filmmaker I even suspected of paying direct homage to him. The influence of Pasolini does seem to be very pronounced in La Chimera. It even comes down right to that title, the use of the phrase La Chimera, because I know a lot of you out there might be thinking, like I did, wait, you mean like the Chimera, the monster from Greek mythology, the lion-headed, winged snake-tail thing? And I'm not going to say that that mythic resonance maybe isn't another layer to Rohrwacher's particular invocation of that phrase, but I was very edified to discover in a little bit of research before doing this review that in Italian, chimera is a somewhat old-fashioned turn of phrase that connotes something being unrealistic or fanciful in a problematic way. It's not like the way we might describe it in English as either simply a mixture of two things or especially a particularly ugly mixture of two things. It has more to do with an idea or an object of desire in the Italian lexicon. Something like what this British expatriate slumming it in southern Tuscany or wherever, what might have brought him to this point in his life where his only passion is stealing from the ancient dead to make just enough money to scrape by. Something like that. That's La Chimera that he's chasing. But even in the context of the film, the use of the phrase is very fascinating because when Arthur's friend describes him as having La Chimera, he clearly means it as a positive attribute. He's almost using it in a way that has a kind of romantic connotation, this admirable, heroic quality of Arthur, like he is this kind of outlaw figure and is sort of like an icon of the Tombaroli, because he's simultaneously kind of this rough, cynical, temperamental, poor person, but he's also a refined outlaw who's in touch with nature and has this magnetic connection to the world beyond. So just in that title and in that invocation of the phrase, you get this very exciting mixture of the vulgar and the poetic, the sacred and the profane, the rugged and the elegant. Basically, you get straight up something Pasolini would do. And in that same mold, I think you also see the very pronounced influence of Pasolini, almost to the point where homage borders upon this kind of strange, merely postmodern affectation of it, which is the additional mixture of that treading of the line between the vulgar and the poetic, the additional mixture of rather explicit political content. Perhaps the most Pasolini-esque sequence of the film is this really rather long one, at least long enough where it kind of catches you off guard because it reaches a lull where you expect it's coming to an end, but then it just starts right back up again and keeps going, and you're like, oh, nope, this is still going. I thought we were over with this, but no, we're still going. But there is this really cool sequence that basically is presented as an extended montage of Arthur and the Tombaroli and their various misadventures, and it's accompanied by a local singer-songwriter singing not just a song, but a ballad made in homage to these guys, where the content of the song is really not subtle at all, where the singer is explicitly telling us, yeah, you say these guys are bad people, but this is what inequality does. The rich steal from the poor all the time, and now the poor even have to basically desecrate the graves and holy sites of their own ancestors just to get by. Very Pasolini-esque, something that felt especially reminiscent of his 1966 comedy, The Hawks and the Sparrows. And I don't want to keep harping on the Pasolini comparison in a way that suggests there's no original bone in Rohrwacher's body, because my point in describing these resonances and feelings isn't even so much to emphasize any overly obvious element of Rohrwacher's homage, so much as it is to say that what makes La Chimera so excitingly peculiar is that without even necessarily being too obvious about it, it feels not only in form stylistically, but also in spirit so out of place and time, like in a way that I guess is very appropriate given the subject of characters who rob ancient tomb sites, and where this Arthur character seems to enter into these metaphysical states where he's connected between the present and the past in a way. As far as the film, it feels almost like while on the surface it's quite contemporary, we can still feel that reverberation of the past in terms that can't really be pinned down just to how the camera moves or how the narrative is structured or how editing is being paced. Like the most obvious throwback to old-fashioned Italian filmmaking that Rohrwacher and the editor Nelly Chetier do in this is that there will be occasions, especially farcical ones, when the tombaroli are running, like from The Cops, and the frame rate will be sped up, but then again, I don't know if they maybe even were committed to doing it so they captured that effect in camera. I'm not sure if it's cinematography or editing. But that speeding up of frame rate in a comedic scene, especially in a running scene, that's something that not only Pasolini, but I think a lot of Italian filmmakers from the 60s or 70s might have done in their own time, but as their own throwback to a sort of more innocent, enchanted style of silent film comedies. So when you see it in La Chimera, it's like a throwback to a throwback, and that's definitely the most obvious place where you're like, okay, this is paying homage to older sort of borderline magical realist Italian movies. But even besides all that, the thing about La Chimera is that those reverberations of the past remain largely spiritually felt, where I almost felt like I must be getting a sense of what Arthur is experiencing when he's standing over the site of some undiscovered, unplundered tomb, and he feels La Chimera radiating out from the earth and into him. The film has that quality where the surface is so contemporary, and yet there is this sense that its spirit is not, that behind the veil of this contemporary film, there might have even been a film just like this from the 70s, like the best Pasolini movie that Pasolini never made. Now, I can't necessarily say that all of those things add up to something quite as good as that. In fact, it's probably closer to say that if La Chimera is an accomplishment at all, it's an accomplishment in the fact that it is a contemporary film that feels like it could have been not the best Pasolini movie that Pasolini never made, but a movie that could have been made during that era that would have been very much of its time and had some really exciting qualities contingent with its time and the shared style and themes of films in that era, but where the film itself wouldn't necessarily rate much higher than a marginal example of that era. It wouldn't be something that ends up being canonized. It might be one that is a personal favorite of a lot of people, but it's not something that would be paying homage to. If this is a work of homage, it's not doing the best thing of a work of homage can do, which is really cracking that threshold where it breaks through the homage so that you have the homage down so well, you actually ascend to the level of the thing you're paying homage to, but in your own time and in your own context. And I don't think La Chimera quite gets there. In particular, I just don't think that the ensemble cast was particularly strong. Not to say that it was bad, but only to say that it just felt a little uninspired given the material. And bless him, I just don't think O'Connor is particularly exciting as our lead. I just wouldn't have pegged him for a foreign Franco Chitti type. I'm sorry in that treading the line between the vulgar and poetic, that rugged and the refined. He just doesn't have the rugged part down quite enough for me. He's a little too obviously still a fancy boarding school lad in this setting that not only makes the chemistry between himself and the rest of the indigenous Tombaroli a tad difficult to buy into, but also especially when it comes down to the romantic subplot between Arthur and this single mother who works for Flora. She's played by Carol Duarte. I especially don't think there was nearly enough magnetism between O'Connor and Duarte as there was magnetism between O'Connor and Dirt. And as an aside about the really obvious Pasolinian symbolism, Duarte's character is literally named Italia, like Italy is supposed to be falling in love with this romantic outsider outlaw, but I'm sorry, O'Connor's just not at his best as a romantic lead here, and frankly, a lot of the problems of the movie really landing for me just sort of radiate out from that miscasting. Then again, like I said, I was really optimistic about seeing this as a long-awaited follow-up to Happy as Lazaro, so perhaps I just set myself up for some unfair disappointment, and overall, I still think there's enough really pretty and striking stuff in La Chimera to give it a forceful recommendation for anyone out there looking to imbibe a cool little throwback Italian art house film. And honestly, I'm sort of more delighted to know what people who have less experience with Italian art house films in general make of it. For them, at the very least, they're in for something refreshing, offbeat, and that I hope, with where it all ends, manages to strike a heavier chord with them than it necessarily did with me. So, yeah, that all being said, I'm giving La Chimera a respectable 3.5 out of 5. Definitely worth a commute if you need to in order to see it on the big screen. All right, wrapping things up, thank you for watching. Please share this video and channel with your fellow movie-poisoned friends and family. If you've seen La Chimera, also, let me hear from you in the comments, especially things that you think I missed out on. Other than that, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'll catch you guys next time.